We've heard a lot about, this morning and in previous sessions, about various challenges in terms of collaboration. Particularly, we've heard a lot from people giving evidence before about this challenge of joint leadership across health and local authority. It's something that's consistently been raised, and also, you know, managing parents' expectations, lots of other challenges, and also funding. And I wondered what you felt the balance was between those issues. Do you find when you go to do inspections that there are issues that are purely funding related, or do you consistently find you know, these other factors in terms of leadership and management that are more impactful? What do you feel is the balance of that?
Shall I go? So we obviously hear a lot about funding when we're on inspection. You'd have to be deaf not to hear that. But it isn't funding that makes the difference between areas that get a written statement of action or not a written statement of action. So funding isn't one of the aspects that Ofsted looks at. We don't have the remit to look at funding in any of our inspection work. But, you know, clearly some local areas manage the constraints that they're under better than other local areas.
I think an important aspect, you know, within that is that it is about the culture of leadership, and I know we keep on, you know, repeating this, but that is the most consistent finding, because we go into areas that we know have funding challenges and yet deliver the best they possibly can. And what the feature is there, which is the thing that we find on all our inspections, is that the best allies of local areas are actually parents. And parents understand the constraints that are on local authorities and upon health services. They understand that, and that's why they're a critical partner in this, because the areas that work with parents as their allies, you know, and have shifted away from this adversarial relationship between parents and local authorities, they understand the constraints and they still work around provision. And in some of the best areas, it's parents' involvement on actually deciding what services need to be withdrawn or scaled back, that parents are involved in that. So again, it's really about culture, which is where we see the best and the worst of areas.
We've heard a lot about that adversarial element, but you've seen examples of where councils have been able to overcome that and to manage it well.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Anything from a health perspective?
I mean, I think I would agree. I mean, I think in CQC we do in other parts of the sector do some assessments of what we call use of resources, and in a sense absolute funding is one of those elements, but there's no point in having funding for 6 OTs if 5 of those posts are vacant and you can't recruit to them, you know. So it is about how you think about what are the resources that we need and how do those resources best work together. I think that areas where those and there are 2 ways in which the adversarial relationships can operate. One is between the system and the children, parents and young people, and the other is within the system. So if places are still having those arguments about whether this is an education need or a health need, is there a label to go alongside the needs that this child is expressing, and who's responsible for assigning that label? Areas that are working best actually, and I think a big issue in relation to waiting lists, and the committee may know that we did a previous thematic review around child and adolescent mental health services, and again that's a big tension in this system, sitting slightly off to the side sometimes, but actually really often at the heart of what it is that people need. And it's when systems are able to come together to say, how do we bring all of our resources together to best meet this need, not how it is that we fight about whose argument that is. And that then enables parents and children and young people to feel that those players are on their side, that they're not part of never mind a tussle between them and the system, but the system isn't tussling about them either. And we've seen some amazing examples of where that happens, and actually where those maturity of relationships with parents mean that I think sometimes what leaders are anxious about is being presented with undeliverable wish lists actually doesn't happen, because parents are very realistic, and that the earlier they're able to see that you're meeting their children's needs, and the less they need to get into the legal and adversarial processes to fight for what their child needs, the more constructive that whole environment is, and the more constructive it is for new parents coming forward who aren't hearing those conversations at the kindergarten gate about how difficult it is if their child starts to present with needs that they want to understand.
Nigel?
Yeah, emphasise the same point, I think, and certainly the child and adolescent mental health thematic that we completed last year, that highlighted the complexity of the system and the lack of coordination in local areas for services. And actually where we saw it worked the best actually was where they gave a focus on children and young people, and that is how people delivered the right service. And I think Ursula's comment about parental wish lists, I think my experience and the experience we've had of the inspections is that parents are quite happy with the Morris Minor. They're not really looking for a Rolls-Royce service. They really have a very clear level of what they expect. And I think the complexity of the system is really difficult for parents to navigate. If you talk to any parents, they will continually say that they're pushed into a position of an adversarial position because they can't actually find their way around the system, and that particularly applies to the transition points through the system as well. So I think that's a key issue as well here. Communication
is one of those factors that has come up regularly. Do you find, feel free to answer this in a sentence if it suits, do you find there is a correlation between areas that are better or worse funded and performance, or is that kind of irrelevant? We've seen with the funding formulas, some authorities have more funding per head than others. Is that something that you see as a factor in terms of outcomes of your inspections? And have you ever been to an authority where you felt actually these guys are doing everything they possibly can, but there is just not enough money, or are there always those mitigating factors?
Well, as I said before, we don't look at the money, but we do look at the impact that those authorities where everyone is doing everything they can to work together, they would be highly unlikely to get a written statement of action. The written statement of action is given where we find weaknesses in the system, inconsistencies, all the points that Ursula was making. That's what leads to a written statement of action.
When you go for an inspection, I know you don't assess funding needs or anything like that, but do you look and go, where do these guys sit in terms of the amount they get? Does that feed into anything that you look at all?
No, that's not in the framework.
Because what we're going in to evaluate the local area's implementation of the reforms.
So through that, you don't look at the money per se. Obviously, use of resources, things we talked about. You would, I assume, assess things like where those resources were deployed. So it was numbers of staff. Have they got enough staff? Can they things like that?
We do, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we do look at some aspects, such as the number of parents that have had to go to tribunal to get to get through to the EHC plans. There is a variability when you go to different local areas about the proportions, so some local areas there'll be very few parents that have to take the local area to tribunal. In other local areas there'll be huge proportions of parents that have to take that action. That we don't look at the finances of that, but obviously big picture we know that that's a very expensive way of spending limited resources.